But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
John F. Kennedy was elected as American president in November 1960 after a rigorous campaign that promised U.S. superiority over the Soviet Union in the field of missile defense and space exploration missions. Prior to the 1960 election victory, Kennedy had been strongly and publicly speaking out against the so-called missile gap that he and many other U.S. senators felt had formed between the Cold War enemies of the Soviet Union and the United States, this due to the apparent inaction of President Dwight D. Eisenhower's previous administration. Beyond raw U.S. military might, Kennedy also used America's flagship aerospace technology as a further symbol of national power and prestige, pledging to make the U.S. not first, or first armed, but first, period. However, despite President John F. Kennedy's rousing rhetoric and very public anti-Soviet speeches, he did not immediately grasp the importance or come to a decision once he became America's president on the status of the Apollo space program and its plans for manned missions to the moon. Apparently knowing very little initially about the technical details and capabilities of the space program, and was further put off by the massive financial commitment that would amount to billions of taxpayers' dollars required to make a reality of NASA's manned moon landing missions. When Kennedy's newly appointed NASA Administrator James E. Webb requested a 30% budget increase for his agency, Kennedy immediately supported this as an acceleration of NASA's large booster program but deferred a decision on the broader Apollo issue and program initiated by President Eisenhower under the guise of Project Mercury. However, all this dramatically changed when on April 12, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to fly in space, reinforcing American fears and paranoia about being left behind and losing in a technological competition and race with its perceived Cold War enemy, the Soviet Union. At a hurriedly arranged special meeting of the U.S. House Committee on Science and Astronautics the day after Soviet Gagarin's triumphant flight, many congressmen pledged their support for a crash course program aimed at ensuring that America would catch up with the Soviets. Once again, despite his very public anti-Soviet statements to the contrary, Kennedy remained as circumspect as ever in his response to this news, refusing to make a confirmed commitment on America's answer to the Soviet space victory. On April 20th, Kennedy eventually took note of Congress's panic and sent a memo to Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, asking Johnson to look into the status of America's space program and into any programs that could offer NASA any possible opportunity to catch up with the USSR. Johnson responded approximately 1 week later, concluding that we are neither making maximum effort nor achieving results necessary if this country is to reach a position of space leadership. His memo concluded that a manned moon landing was sufficiently far enough in the future that it was likely the United States could achieve it first and this before the Soviets. On May 25, 1961, 20 days after the first U.S. manned spaceflight of Freedom 7, Kennedy hurriedly changed his administration's tack to challenge the Soviet Union and subsequently proposed the manned moon landing in a special message conveyed to the U.S. Congress on urgent national needs. The Apollo program, President Dwight D. Eisenhower's project and not Kennedy's, which was previously known and designated as Project Mercury, was now to be given as the sole and only priority of America's space agency NASA, which by then was directly supervised and controlled by the Kennedy administration and headed by America's then Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. Thus America's Apollo space program and its manned missions to the moon finally came into being. At the time of Kennedy's proposal, only one American had ever flown in space, and this was less than a month earlier, as well NASA had not yet sent astronauts into Earth's orbit, and even some of NASA's very own employees seriously doubted whether Kennedy's ambitious goal could ever realistically be met. Landing men on the moon by the end of 1969 would require the most sudden burst of technological creativity, skill and scientific expertise, and also the largest commitment of governmental resources ever made, at an astonishing figure of some 24 billion taxpayers' dollars, and this by any nation in its modern-day peacetimes. At its peak, NASA's employees worked flat out round the clock 24/7, with the Apollo space program employing more than 400,000 people and requiring the skill and support of over 20,000 industrial firms and corporations, as well the expertise over many American universities and college campuses. However, despite all of this, it would appear President Kennedy may well have had his doubts too at times, as in another example of the sudden and unpredictable change in nature of the Kennedy administration's tact and the president's very bold and public anti-Soviet speeches, Kennedy audaciously proposed a joint USSR-US moon mission, and this to be publicly aired in the United Nations Congress. This resulted in complete chaos within the Kennedy camp, with a public outcry led by Congress and senators demanding the draft proposal due to be aired at the United Nations be hastily withdrawn to be rewritten in a crude and rash attempt to tone down its conciliatory language and content. However, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, after discreetly considering the detail, only became ever more deeply suspicious of the Kennedy olive branch, amidst the deepening hostile Cold War tensions of Vietnam, Cuba and Canada's very own burgeoning and domestic crisis of American civil rights. Khrushchev politely refused the offer, citing espionage as America's true intent. Nevertheless, the American Apollo space program continued and completely unabated. Kennedy's goal was finally accomplished on the Apollo 11 moon mission when astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed their lunar module on July 20, 1969, and walked as the first men on the lunar surface, with all three crew members being safely returned to Earth on July 24th. 5 subsequent Apollo missions also landed astronauts on the lunar surface, with the last mission in December 1972. In these 6 space flights and missions, 12 men in total walked on the surface of the moon. Apollo ran from 1961 to 1972, with its first manned flights in 1968. It eventually achieved Kennedy's goal and stated aim of manned lunar landings before the decade was out, and this despite the major setback of the disastrous and lethal 1967 Apollo 1 cabin fire that killed the entire unfortunate crew during a pre-launch test. After the first unsuccessful lunar landings, sufficient flight hardware, technology, materials and budgetary funds remained for 9 more follow-on Apollo missions. However, following complaints at the spiraling costs of America's space program, swinging administrative budgetary cuts forced the eventual axe and cancellation of 3 of these proposed Apollo moon landing missions. Nevertheless, 5 of the remaining 6 missions again went on to claim successful moon landings, with only the aborted Apollo 13 moon landing mission prevented by a catastrophic oxygen tank explosion, and whilst in direct flight and transit to the moon, this severely damaged the craft's life support systems. Nevertheless, the ill-fated Apollo 13 crew thankfully were returned safely to Earth. The Apollo spacecraft used the advanced Saturn family of rockets as its Earth launch vehicle. This vehicle was also used for other Apollo application programs, such as the Skylab, a space station that supported 3 manned missions from 1973 to 1974, and the Apollo-Soyuz test project, a joint Earth orbit mission with the Soviet Union, which was organized in 1975. America's Apollo space program made several noted major human spaceflight advances, standing alone in sending manned missions beyond low Earth orbit, with Apollo 8 as the first manned spacecraft to complete an full orbit and claim circumnavigation of another celestial body. The program returned in total some 382 kilograms of lunar rocks and soil back to Earth, this in greatly contributing to the growing understanding of the Moon's composition and geological history. The program laid a firm foundation in furthering the United States space ambitions, as will the space agency NASA's technical, scientific and human spaceflight capabilities. Apollo can also be said to have spurred on many advances and in many divergent areas of technology and industry which are incidental and unrelated to rocketry or manned spaceflight, this including avionics, telecommunications, even modern-day computers, as well as everyday automobiles.
Coming right. 40. 5,000 feet. 39. 39. 38. 39. 4,000 feet. 40. 41. 45. 47. 52. 3,000 feet. 52. 52. 51. 50. 47. 47. 2,000 feet. 42. Okay, got a good spot. Good. 42. 43. 300 feet.
Falcon Houston, you're go for landing.
45. Roger, go for landing. 44. 45. 1,000 feet. 45. 900. 45. 800. 45. 700. 46. 600. 48. 500. 49. Minus 17. Minus 15. 400 and minus 14. Yep, T66. Okay. 300 feet. Minus 11. Minus 11. 250. Minus 11. 9% fuel. 200, minus 11. 150, minus 7. Minus 6. 120 feet, minus 6. Okay, I've got some left. Minus 5, 100 feet at 5. 9% fuel. Minus 5. 80 at 5. Minus 3. 60 at 3. 50 at 3. Cross pointers look good. 40 at 3. 33. 25. 2. 7% fuel. 20 at 1. 15 at 1. Minus 1. Minus 1. 6% fuel. 10 feet, minus 1. 8 feet, minus 1. Contact. Man. Okay, Houston, the Falcon is on the plane at Hadley.
Roger, Roger, Falcon.
In August 1971, long after the public became tired of the live televised intrusions to relate the latest Apollo success, and Senate and Congress was long felt murmuring disquiet over the ever-escalating space program costs, which presently stood at a staggering and obscene sum of some 24 billion American taxpayers' dollars. This was way in excess of President Kennedy's estimate at the turn of the decade of 40 cents per week deducted in direct taxation for every American man, woman and child. Therefore, America's then-President Richard Nixon felt sufficiently moved following the overall mission success to take the unprecedented step of considering outright cancellation of all future and proposed Apollo moon landing missions, and this just after the successful conclusion of the Apollo 15 mission. Before the House and Congress, Nixon boldly proposed the cancellation of the 2 remaining lunar landing missions of Apollo 16 and 17. However, the then Deputy of the Office of Management and Budget Responsibility, Caspar Weinberger, was strongly opposed to this, eventually persuading Nixon to keep the remaining 2 missions on. Apollo 17 was the last mission of the Apollo space program to set sail from the launch pad on the 7th of December 1972, landing in the Taurus-Littrow region of the Moon and returning safely its men and crew on December the 19th to claim yet another prize and successful moon landing in the name of the United States of America. This closed finally the Apollo chapter and America's manned missions to the Moon.
Well, in my left hand I have a feather. In my right hand a hammer. And I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon. And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our Falcon, and I'll drop the 2 of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that? It proves that Mr. Galileo was correct in his findings. Fourth stage, it's armed Afghan. 99 Pro.